present? Is that the idea?
Yes, so the erosion channelization is present, not present. The invasive species is, sorry, let me stop. For the folks on the phone, the question was about erosion and channelization and invasive species. Was it a present or not present? Or whether it was a percentage based of the area. And for invasive species, it's a percentage observation. And there's categories, so you're not going like 25.5%. So we're not.
And it's pretty big categories.
Yeah. So they're broad categories, and we've done a lot of sensitivity analysis on this, and I think we'd be happy to talk about that if you're interested in more of how those things actually play out in the end. But a lot of it is driven by other factors here. And if we've gone through, I've looked at a lot of information that could possibly characterize baseline here, so I'm always happy to consider more at this point. Yes.
So I'm guilty because I started this, but I think questions like this make sense. People should hold, but with some notion that there's a mailing list so that if they pose questions or are submitting additional data, that somehow gets transmitted to everybody who's working on this. So everybody can stay up on what's going on afterwards, but we can still get done in 2 hours today what you folks need to get done in 2 hours.
Sure. So for folks on the phone, that was that if there's additional information that people want to put out there, and correct me if I'm summarizing this wrong, why don't we hold on that and create a mailing list to share information. All right, so moving on to our required compensatory restoration. And this is for the compensation. It's not primary restoration within the area of impact, but it's to compensate for those losses. There's a couple different things that go into this. You have your loss, which is what we had talked about already. You have a habitat conversion factor, a discount rate, and a restoration equivalency ratio. I'll talk about each of those now in a little bit more detail here. So the habitat conversion factor is how do two different habitats relate to each other in their productivity. And this is something I deal with on a number of different sites across the country. And it's because oftentimes there might not be the opportunity to do restoration in a certain habitat type, or it might be a small piece of NRD, and the 90% of it is going to be restoration of wetlands, but there's going to be 10% of the, injury to wetlands, 10% of injury was to something else. And to gain economy of scale or be cost effective, you want to do one type of restoration project here. And so historically, and there is precedent for using Peterson et al. 2007, and that's based on primary productivity ratios in other NRDs across the country, and it is based on for here we're looking at open freshwater habitat to wetlands habitat in a 3-to-1 ratio.
Right, so essentially we're just creating a common currency because we want to be able to have a standard method, and so we're essentially converting everything to a wetland yep. Common currency. And also because there are sites that have a mosaic, so we'll just
go to wetlands.
So that we're not having to deal with multiple habitats.
So if you have 3 acres of open water habitat, it's 1 acre of wetland habitat. Or vice versa, of course.
Generically, all wetland habitat is just this category called wetland habitat.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. And so for folks on the phone, was there any distinction between different types of wetlands? And as we know, there's a lot of different types of wetlands across the state, but there is not. It's just all wetlands.
And you'll see if you want to look at the state of Washington, they took a very detailed approach along those lines, and we felt that was a little more intense than we wanted to be.
So efficiency, again, is a goal here. So if we went, and there could be 100 different types of wetlands when you get down to it.
I think I want to make sure I understand something. Because what you're still trying to get at here, though, is, because in my mind, there are 2 pieces to it that are very important. One is the amount of dollars that get charged, for lack of a better term, to the offending party, and then the project that gets done in recovery. and you're talking with these things about how you determine the dollars
Yes.
to charge, and that the idea around what you're doing with the money is sort of a separate bucket.
Yes, and I'll talk about that in my next
Yeah.
presentation.
I just want to make sure that that's
Yep.
what we're.
So this is all part of the valuation stage
Yes.
of the natural resource damage assessment. After there is a settlement, or court case for that matter, the dollars will be then implemented in restoration through a different process. Discount rate, we're only talking 1 year here right now, so it's not as applicable, but if we did talk about more than a year out into the future, this is, sorry, for our loss it's not applicable, but here, because of restoration, we're gonna do a restoration project today, and that restoration project is gonna last forever in our assumptions here. Now, granted, it may not last forever for a whole host of reasons, but for treating all these spills the same here. So we have to take those benefits from out years and bring them back into present value. And we would do the same if the loss extended into future years. So instead of going for a 1 year loss, we went for 10 years, we would back up everything into present present value injuries or benefits. And that gets at the time value of money or the time value of the services provided by that resource. So those wetland resources provided today are valued more by the citizens than something that you would get in 10 years, just as if I gave you $1 today or $1 in 10 years. All right, and so then restoration equivalency ratio is the next.
Well, can I, because it's
Sure.
rattling around in my head. So does the entity that's paying the damages ultimately bear the risk of the delay of the restoration project?
No, the trustee does.
Okay.
Yeah. In this
Makes
case,
more sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
yeah, good question, though. So the question for folks on the phone was does the PRP, does the potentially responsible party bear the risk of a delay in the restoration project? And the answer is no, in this case it does not. And this is for this approach that we're developing here.
But that's, I mean, because there was the length of time, like conceptually, there was the length of time that the area was damaged in that it was coated in oil. And one assumes that the cleanup took care of that, and that is not part of, I mean, that, how long was it damaged, was it coated in oil, is part of what you were talking about here. That was the 1 year.
That was the loss.
That was the 1 year.
Yeah.
Then there's the, so this is the other piece of that, because it's in this weird in-between state where it's no longer damaged, it's no longer coated in oil, but it hasn't been restored to like a better state.
So let me,
Yeah.
so
You know, like,
sort of,
oil's
let
gone,
me,
but the nutrients
yeah,
aren't
I'm
sucking
with
around
you.
yet.
I think I'm with you here.
I think they
Let
can
me-
actually hear Alicia, she's pretty, I don't think we need to
Okay.
repeat her question.
Yeah.
She's
All
pretty
right.
vocal. No, it's good, she's a good public servant, she's projecting.
All right, so let's just take a step back here, just to the loss again where we were. When you say it was coated in oil, that is true. The oil is cleaned up and removed, but just because it was cleaned up and removed doesn't mean that the services being provided are back to baseline. There, if you removed some vegetation, that vegetation has to grow again. If you removed sediment, that sediment would have to be recolonized by microorganisms and benthic macroinvertebrates and so on and so on. And that, we said, took a year. That year was based on the time to permanent solution, which may or may not be, may be an over or underestimate of the actual time to recover for baseline to any one individual spill. That's the time for the loss. If it went out into the future, there would be 1 year of loss for the current year and 1 year of loss for the next year and so on. And those next years, those future years, would be discounted back to 2018 or whatever year.
Right, and
We're
right
in.
now, what we are thinking about is having it be 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, depending on when it reaches permanent solution or the resource that was affected by this bill, but that, in terms of back testing the model, we just chose the 1 year. But I think also part of your question is, so that's the loss side. Then the restoration can happen anywhere in that subwatershed, for example. And you're saying, okay, if I were to undertake, in this case, we are making the assumption that you are undertaking a wetland restoration project. And we are basically saying, if you do, we're going to assume that they will continue to provide ecological services into the future. And that's not necessarily the case, but we're making an assumption for the purposes of the model that that's what would happen.
And that's likely to overestimate the benefits received from the restoration project rather than underestimate those benefits, which would then result in likely to underestimate damages. But we say in perpetuity, this discount rate of 3% makes in perpetuity inapplicable beyond 100 years, because you're discounting down to a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what you're actually getting. So again, thinking of it, the time value of money, $1 today, if you discount it from 100 years in the future, your interest rate would be what it is, despite our low interest rates now. Okay. So, restoration equivalency ratio, are there any other questions on this before I go on? Okay. Equivalency ratio here. This is something that we've thought a lot about in NRDA across the country as well. And this gets at what is functionally equivalent to a natural habitat. And there's been numerous papers out there, a number of review papers out there that have looked at the function of a created or restored wetland compared to the function of a natural wetland, and it is often not as high as the natural wetland, and that takes into account both our ability as humans to create natural habitat, but also the build up to full function and a number of other things in there. Sorry, was it give a question? No, okay.
Well, yeah, although I think we're thinking the same, which is, I'm just wondering, is there kind of a more detailed version of this that actually has the sources that would allow people to get underneath it and then provide comments on the details, which again is not what we're here for today, but so they would know the basis for the ratio and say, no, this is why it should be a different ratio?
Well, it's a great question. So the question is there more detail than this slideshow? And the next deliverable from Scott, based on the questions we got at our advisory committee meeting and the questions that you're all raising today, is a report. And we want that report to be responsive and provide the kind of information people are looking for. So yes, we will be sharing that.
And it will be shared in time, certainly for additional input and well before any regs go out for official public comment.
Right. And I also want to mention that I'm working with Lily and Nikhil on an annotated bibliography so that you'll get to see a lot of the primary sources as well.
Karen, I assume it's the case, but will you take questions via letter after this?
Oh, email, yes. Send me, I'll be your primary point of contact just to make sure, we keep track of everyone's communications. And we'll talk about how to set up a good way to make sure everybody's in the loop.
It may just fall on you that it
To
goes
summarize
to you
it and say,
use
this week's news. Right.
So this is based on these primary sources that you're talking about there. And to keep things moving here, this is a 3-to-1 ratio for wetlands and a 4-to-1 ratio for eelgrass. So 3 acres of wetlands required, restored or created wetlands is equivalent to 1 acre of natural wetlands. Alright, so now, from the first part, we got what our loss was using our habitat equivalency analysis for 1 year, but you don't really even need a TIA for 1 year. And we got our restoration required, required compensatory restoration. And from that, we now have an acre value of wetlands that need to be a wetlands project that needs to be implemented. And this is where we get at costing this out. And just as before, there's a handful of inputs to this, and I'll just run through these here and take questions as people have them. Habitat restoration costs are $603,000 per acre, and that's based on the Massachusetts in lieu fee program, which was promulgated in 2014.
And based on Massachusetts ecological restoration projects that have been implemented by our colleagues at the Department of Fish and Game.
That's the underlying
Data.
that went into that in lieu fee program. So special natural resource factor, because the compensation is replaced or acquired the equivalent of those natural resources, there's extra things that are usually going into special natural resources. These could be scenic waterways, endangered species, and there's a list of things that will be shared in the final report. And for that, management of those before the oil spill, it takes extra management because